The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone. I'm just seeing Alana here right now. I'm gonna just wait for a couple minutes to see if anybody is showing up here. I just want to make sure that we have a chance for people to come in. Um, but yeah, we should be getting started in I would say just a couple minutes here. Yeah, so stay tuned. Hi there. I'm just getting a note from Dorte here that there's a couple people who didn't get their links for this, so I'm just going to quickly invite them. Just give me 1 minute here before we get started. Hi everyone. I just sent off an invite to a few people who had a little bit of trouble getting the link for the presentation here. Dorte was Karen, Andrea, and I think it was Karemi. Or no, Cami, sorry. So I just sent those off. They should have received emails. And if there's any other issues, Victoria's also on the line here, and she can help make sure that they get their links to be able to join. So sorry about the delay here. We can get started right now. So thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate you showing up for the webinar today. I know that COVID has kind of affected everybody's schedule and volunteer plan, and it's kind of important for us to be able to take some time and think about how we're doing our work given this new kind of circumstance that we're in right now. Sorry, I'm just seeing one more question here from Dorte. I just want to make sure that everyone's kind of able to access, but I think that we're good now. So I'm just going to introduce the webinar here a little bit and lay out some kind of housekeeping here. Sorry, I'm just noticing here, Dorte, your hand is up, and I'm just going to unmute if you want to say something before we get started here. Was that what you were hoping for?
Oh, hi, Granny. Sorry, I couldn't hear you at all. I just was able to click around and find the spot where it was going to work. So I'm in now.
Oh, perfect.
I just wanted to say there were 3 people who didn't get links, and I don't know if you were able to contact them.
Yeah, so I just sent off some invites to them. So it was to Cami and Andrea and I think it was Karen. So yeah. I just sent them off, and they should be able to attend now. If they're having any more issues, Victoria is also on the line here, and she can help them attend.
Come on.
Yeah. We'll also be recording today's webinar too. So if anybody is having any issues that, like, if there's any computer issues, like people having, compatibility issues or anything like that, we'll also make sure to send out the recording and keep ourselves available for questions afterwards, just as kind of a backup.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. Okay. So yeah, let's get started here. So my name is Graham. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Programs here at Volunteer Alberta. And my job has a lot to do with the various different learning and development initiatives that Volunteer Alberta runs on a regular basis. And these types of webinars on various different topics related to volunteer management, often for me it's volunteer screening, are really kind of core to what Volunteer Alberta does. We're a capacity building organization that helps nonprofit organizations in Alberta do their work more efficiently. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be here. I also have Victoria Petta on the line, and she's going to be doing kind of tech for the webinar here. So if you have any issues with the software, or if you need any help with anything, feel free to contact Victoria. So I think she left her email in the chat here, but if there's anybody who came in late, Victoria, do you want to just paste that message into the chat one more time, just so everyone kind of has access to it and they can look at your email and get in contact with you if need be? But she'll be here to help with anything. Okay. So let's talk about volunteer recruitment and re-engagement today. So this webinar, it focuses on recruiting volunteers and engaging them and re-engaging them. But we're going to kind of treat engagement and re-engagement as kind of similar topics. But the topic of recruitment and re-engagement are unique in a lot of different ways. But there's some really definite similarities between the two that we're going to talk about today. Mainly, both processes require you to think about what your organization's needs are and assess how volunteers can help meet those needs. I have a question here from Nancy. Are we supposed to be able to see the presenters? I'm going to keep my webcam off for now, so I guess I should have noted that. I'm going to turn on my webcam in the Q&A portion of the presentation, and then I'll take questions and everything at the end. So I'm just going to kind of go through the content portion here, and then we'll turn on the webcam and I'll have a little bit of a chat. Yeah, so, but I'll make sure that if anybody has questions or anything like that, we'll kind of get to them at the end. So if there's any questions you have about content, we'll touch on them in the Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about recruiting volunteers, you may be really well equipped to know where to find volunteers. Like that's a topic that some people kind of have their own systems for, but you might be wondering actually how to get them involved in the work that you do. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about recruitment. This requires you to think about what needs to actually be done to entice people to actually do the work that you're offering. And then after you found your volunteers and they've been with you for a little while, you kind of take a similar approach to re-engage existing volunteers. So, you gather feedback and you assess what your organization needs and figure out how to best deploy your volunteers. In essence, for both processes, you're kind of finding the right person to do the right job, and you're defining a productive ongoing relationship with your volunteers. And this presentation, it was originally developed with content from our volunteer screening program. And that's kind of the lens that we take when we're talking about volunteer recruitment and engagement. When we screen volunteers, it's not just about making sure that they meet some minimum standard of safety when working with clients. It's about matching volunteers with roles that are appropriate for them and laying groundwork for an appropriate relationship with your volunteers. To do this, it requires that you learn what motivates them, what gets them involved, what engages them, and then when you know these things, you can continue to deliver them roles that they'll excel in and that they'll find gratifying and that they'll reflect positively on, and then ultimately that they'll work safe in. So that's what the connection to volunteer screening is. We might mention it a few times throughout the presentation. But yeah, to summarize this webinar, it's going to discuss the importance and benefits of a good volunteer recruitment strategy. And we'll talk about the different aspects that you should consider when you're developing a volunteer recruitment strategy. And then we'll get into re-engagement and talk about how you can ensure volunteers return to do the work that both you and the volunteer care about. Both these topics, they're going to help you help your organization better define how it works with your volunteers, and ultimately it'll help you continuously improve. Okay. Sorry, I'm just making sure my slides move. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so let's quickly run through what we actually mean when we talk about recruitment and engagement and re-engagement. So volunteer recruitment, it can seem a lot just like finding volunteers, but it also involves a lot of forethought and a lot of planning. So recruitment, it includes the work that your organization does before the volunteer recruitment drives and the advertising campaigns and the posts for volunteer wanted, stuff like that. Before you actually reach out to see who wants to volunteer, you'll inevitably have questions like, who will be doing this work? And who are we going to reach out to? And why do we need these volunteers? And how do we find the right volunteers? And that's all part of volunteer recruitment. But it also includes all the obvious stuff, advertising, promotion, networking. These are all parts of volunteer recruitment as well, and we'll talk about that. Volunteer engagement is all about getting volunteers motivated. And this is different than just getting them to care about a cause, meaning, it actually means that your volunteers show up and that you understand why they're showing up. Some volunteers are there because they care passionately about the cause, obviously, but some people are there to meet new people or try new things. Some people are there to develop their resumes, and all of these reasons are perfectly valid. And the work of volunteer engagement is understanding your volunteers so you can meet them where they're at and offer them opportunities that actually work for them. When we talk about re-engagement, though, it's the same process. People change over time, and it's your job to keep up to date with your volunteers so you can continue to keep them motivated. Okay, so let's get started with volunteer recruitment. We're going to talk a little bit about volunteer recruitment strategies first, because we kind of think about volunteer recruitment as, being very related to the strategic aspect of this work. So we're going to go over volunteer recruitment strategies first. To get started, volunteer recruitment, it goes beyond just putting a generic post on the internet. Organizations and programs, they should actually be able to articulate their goals and their mandates and the importance of the work that they do so they can target positions and create meaningful opportunities for volunteers. We all know why volunteers can and typically are vital to organizations. Before we dig deeper into recruitment and hiring strategies, though, we need to actually think about like what a good recruitment strategy actually is, and why it's important to your volunteer program. In thinking about your volunteer recruitment strategy, the first thing that you should be considering is your programming and what goals you're trying to achieve and how those goals actually align with your mandate. More specifically, having a strong volunteer recruitment strategy and a strong volunteer core can directly feed into your program's mandate. So one of the first things that you should consider when you're developing a recruitment strategy is what's outlined in your operational plan. So what gaps exist in the work that you plan on doing? Are there any goals in your operational plan that you're worried you don't have the capacity to meet? These are the types of questions that your recruitment strategy can fundamentally be affected by. These types of concerns, they'll help you indicate where you might need to find volunteers and what kinds of volunteers you need. By keeping your operational plan in mind, you can consistently ask yourself, how can we achieve what we set out to do, and how can volunteers help make that happen? And with a well thought out operational plan, that could include a mission, value propositions, mandate. Volunteers will naturally align with the strategic directions of your program, and they'll end up supporting your vision. So whether you have a big volunteer program with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, or you have a small volunteer program with maybe 10 volunteers, your goal and your mandate should be the thing that's actually driving your work and driving what you need from volunteers. Okay, with the previous point in mind, well, the core values and the mission and the culture differ depending on organizations and programs. The outcome that matters most to volunteers is actually making an impact and feeling valued. Your volunteer recruitment strategy has to consider how your programs and your volunteers are going to work to actually meet those goals. And from the outset, to ensure that you reiterate to your volunteers how their work fits into what you're doing with your program, and how it fits into the broader mission, vision, and values of your organization. So having a dedicated volunteer manager that checks in and asks for feedback and works alongside volunteers, it can create a supportive environment. And then, hosting volunteer appreciation events or sending out thank you notes that can reinforce the work that your volunteers are doing. All of this is to show your volunteers that you value them and that this work can all feed into your, all of this work can end up feeding into your recruitment strategy because they're natural selling points for your potential volunteers. So the first step in making volunteers feel valued, it can actually start before they actually start volunteering with you because you're showing them that you care about your community, that you care about the volunteer opportunities that you're offering, and that you ultimately care about your volunteers. Following the first 2 points here, programs, they should start demonstrating and articulating the goals and the value of their volunteers. So through this, your program can also boost their presence and impact to further engage the community. And this includes, folks living in more rural areas as well. So volunteers are highly engaged and show up eager to work and make a difference, and they become champions for a program in a certain way. So all of its mission and vision and value and all of the programs and services that your organization offer, your volunteers essentially become brand ambassadors for that. And it's important to think about that when you're developing a volunteer recruitment strategy. So volunteers that are excited about the work that they do, they talk to their friends, they talk to their family, they talk to their coworkers about their experiences. They might share, say, social media posts from your organization, things like that. And this doesn't just help attract new volunteers, but it broadcasts the work that your organization is doing to the public, which is really important. So this should be part of a recruitment strategy as well. It should be a way for organizers to plan how they're going to market their volunteer program to potential volunteers and how its volunteer program will naturally market itself to the community through interaction. And the next thing when we're talking about a volunteer recruitment strategy is just finding the right people for the right jobs. So a general call out can be really beneficial for large events like festivals and things like that. However, when it comes to day-to-day work for a specific program, recruiting skilled volunteers is going to benefit your program and your volunteers. So recruiting volunteers that are actually skilled in the particular thing that you need for that position. So if you're kind of matching those things, like, say, for example, you needed a social media person or a graphic designer, these positions, maybe if we're talking about screening, might work with children a lot. It's really important to make sure that in your recruitment strategy, you're finding ways to actually reach the people who have those skills. And in that way, you're also creating a more safe environment because you're making sure the people who are filling your positions are able to do those positions safely. So. Okay. So now that we have an idea of why a recruitment strategy is important, we can talk about the different things to actually consider when building or updating a recruitment strategy. So the first thing that we're going to consider here is actually who's going to recruit your volunteers. So a lot of different programs have volunteer managers or organizers, whether they're paid staff or volunteers themselves, but not all do. So you might want to consider putting together a team that can see through your volunteer recruitment process. And I can already hear people saying things like, I don't have the time for that. And I totally get it. But you may not have a volunteer manager or a volunteer management team, but if your organization is engaging volunteers, someone is making that happen. So figure out who directly or indirectly supports that work and formally outline that role and ensure that you have commitment from everyone involved so people aren't, so people don't end up doing work that they didn't actually want to do. So for example, if a small organization has a number of board members and an executive director that regularly do call-outs for volunteers to come work with the organization, but they don't actually have a formal volunteer manager or a formal volunteer management process, they might also have like volunteers who spread the word in the community. A recruitment strategy, they should actually outline this work as well and plan for ways to streamline or improve the work and inform everybody of what they're responsible for when it comes to volunteer recruitment. Next is considering what your needs are for volunteering. So it's really crucial to actually think about what we're kind of doing instead of just putting a general call out for volunteers. So consider what you actually need a volunteer for. Like, say that you need a volunteer to walk dogs or fill food hampers. Or maybe it's an operational task like digitizing volunteer records or running your social media or something like that. It may help to actually think about what types of people might actually have these skills and how you might reach them. It may also help to think about what work that needs to get done in your organization as a kind of not being filled by volunteers right now. So say you have some operational tasks or something like that that are constantly on the side of your desk, and you have no time to get those things done. It's also really beneficial for organizations to think about, like, well, what operational tasks that we normally don't fill with volunteers might actually be able to be filled by volunteers, and how would we find people that have the skills to do those things? And then from there, you can kind of use those skills that you've kind of thought about, what your needs are, to help build volunteer positions. And those volunteer positions are going to help you advertise and recruit new volunteers. Next thing with a recruitment strategy, after you've established your need, is just think about how many volunteers you need. So consider each volunteer position and the tasks and duties that are associated with them, and this can help you kind of establish how many volunteers you actually need. So say, for example, you have a festival coming up. I'm just using this as an example. Maybe not a good example with COVID, but we'll go with it. So say you have a festival coming up and you want somebody as a volunteer to do marketing for the festival. Well, that is a pretty huge job. It requires a lot of different things. So you might not actually be looking for just one person. Maybe you could actually split that task up into multiple different things. It could be somebody to do social media, somebody to write content, somebody to edit documents, somebody to spread the word to local businesses. The amount of volunteers you need for that position might actually be, closer to 4 or 5 people that are all kind of doing specialized skills within the position. And then the likelihood of retaining your volunteers will be higher here as well, because obviously you're not burning people out, but also you can specialize the skills that you're giving to people a little bit more so they're doing work that they actually kind of enjoy doing. Okay. Oh. Sorry, I'm just taking a look here to make sure that I'm not missing anything in the questions here. I'm just seeing a few kind of tech questions. Okay, cool. Sorry, I guess Victoria's got it under control, I think. Again, we're recording. Okay, so now that we've kind of considered all the different preliminary pieces to recruiting, we can actually begin the process. This is kind of what we were leading up to here. And there's 3 ways that we're going to talk about today. There are other ways, but I mean, this is kind of the main way that we're going to divvy things up. So mass appeals, targeted recruitment, and networking. So when we're doing mass appeals, these are those big callouts that we see, volunteers wanted. We see them, on bulletin boards and in social media, newsletters, things like that. And this method is definitely helpful for, filling positions that you need to get filled. But generally, they're more helpful for positions that don't need a targeted skill set. So just think about the type of people that might actually see a mass appeal. If it's in the bulletin board for a grocery store or your community league or something like that, anybody could be seeing that. So generally with mass appeals, you want to be advertising positions that are fairly broad in nature and can be done by people of many different ages and abilities. So you don't want to be advertising something really specialized with a mass appeal. But these mass appeals, they could take the form of multiple different things. You could be posting on social media, you can be going on your website, you could be doing newsletters or emails. Lots of really tight-knit communities, like rural communities, they have bulletin boards or communications channels that are kind of specialized for those communities, and you could take advantage of those. And then obviously, we wouldn't be Volunteer Alberta if we didn't mention that FCSSs and volunteer centers in your community are really great ways to actually get the word out there and to match volunteers with the right positions. Another great mass appeal tool that's come out in recent years is Volunteer Connector. So volunteerconnector I think it was .org is run by Propellus in Calgary, and it's essentially like a job board but for volunteers. So definitely take a look at that if you haven't seen it before. And these are all kind of really great mass appeal kind of methods for doing recruitment. Ooh. Okay. And then targeted recruitment is next here. So when we talk about targeted recruitment, this is combining really good position descriptions and your recruitment strategy to actually make sure that you can make contact with people who might have the skill sets that you're really looking for. So targeted recruitment is all about taking those specialized volunteer positions and actually touching base with people that might have those skills. So, for example, you might be looking for somebody to take over social media. I'm mentioning social media because during COVID, doing work online is becoming more and more important. Lots of organizations have a lot of questions around social media right now. So, say you wanted somebody to do this. So your position description, it should lay out, like your volunteer position description, it should lay out everything that your volunteer would be responsible for, including any specialized skills. So this could be things like using post scheduling software or advanced writing skills or experience in marketing or something like that. And from there, you want to actually make connections with people who have those skills. So an example that I'll give is a student club. A student club would be kind of a good place to start because a lot of different post-secondary institutions have, classes and courses within these kind of fields like, digital marketing and advertising and things like that. Even social media, there's classes on social media now. So you could reach out to your local student association or your student clubs and kind of spread the word that way. And then once you have a connection, you can share a position with them and let them know how they can apply. This isn't just a great opportunity for organization to get a skilled volunteer, though. It's also a really degree-relevant learning opportunity for students to build their resume, just this example. But you could also reach out to other organizations as well. There's lots of other nonprofits within the province that are probably doing work that's similar to yours. So if you want to reach out to nonprofits that are doing kind of similar work and ask if there's anybody within their community that might be interested in filling those volunteer positions, that's a really good way to actually start doing some targeted recruitment. We talk a little bit about sharing volunteers sometimes at Volunteer Alberta, because that's also becoming kind of increasingly important with COVID, with people that are kind of short on capacity. Sometimes there's volunteers who really want to help, and they might find that they have skills that would be able to help organizations they don't normally volunteer for. In this presentation, there's a little bit of a handout section, actually. So if you're interested in taking a further look, there's a tip sheet that I've included on sharing volunteers from the volunteer screening program. You can take a look through there. I'll also share out all of these handouts after the presentation. So I'm going to be emailing everybody who attended and everyone who signed up, just to make sure that they get all of these handouts that are attached to the presentation as well. But yeah, there's also other places that you can reach out to. Like there's targeted recruitment opportunities with things like professional associations or unions, or, you know, even just, you know, there's lots of different community groups on Facebook now that are forming just to do grassroots volunteer organization during COVID. So these are all ways that you could do targeted recruitment. Come on. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance the slide here. My computer is being a little bit slow. There we go. Okay, and finally there's networking. So if you're already working with a group of really awesome volunteers, they might know other volunteers. And I know that sometimes networking can seem a little bit like a cop-out, because it seems a little bit like, well, it's easy for some people to say if they already have all of these connections. But I can guarantee you that if you're a nonprofit organization, you do at least have a volunteer core that you can use as a network. Volunteers are great at getting other volunteers to volunteer. So if you have a group of board members that meet on a regular basis and you're looking for volunteers, that might be a great place to start, and just ask if there's anybody who might have the ability to reach out to a few people and spread the word about volunteering. But some of this can also be done through just general networking events, which are not being hosted as much during COVID. But I mean, they're still out there networking with people through things like, you know, mixers and open houses and things like that. In the future, that can be something that you can definitely look into to make sure that you kind of increase your reach and meet new people that might be able to introduce you to a new core of volunteers. Okay, so recruitment. This is kind of the, you know, summary of the recruitment portion of the presentation, focused on getting the right volunteers in the right roles, using methods to do that. The recruitment strategy is highlighting the kind of who, what, when, where, and why of recruitment and of, you know, getting volunteers into your organization. And then the recruitment process is the how. How do we actually recruit people? How do we go out there and do that? And then what's next? So let's talk a little bit about engagement. We spent a lot of time talking about recruitment. We're going to move into engagement here, and also talk about re-engaging. So to begin this section, I'm going to outline just some basic examples to delineate the difference between engagement and recognition, because this is probably one of the first things that people kind of confuse when they're talking about engagement and recognition. Sometimes people think of them as basically the same activity, and they're not. They're definitely not. Recognition is actually kind of a form of engagement, but it's not engagement in itself. So to get started here, let's kind of talk a little bit about what engagement actually is. So engagement includes things that you actually do to get your volunteer actively involved in their role. And it means that they're actually showing up to their role and that they want to be there and that they're invested in the outcome of their work. Outside of the volunteer simply just doing their work, there's a lot of different activities that you can do to get them involved more deeply in their work and engage them better. Considering that this is kind of from a screening perspective, or at least, you know, originally was developed from a screening perspective, first thing we'll talk about here is police information checks. So one of the most simple ways to keep your volunteer engaged is actually just getting them to get their police information check done every few years. And this is certainly not a hard and fast rule for all organizations, because you should really be considering if your volunteer actually needs a police information check. But it can be easy for a volunteer to forget about the risk that's involved in their role, and this is an opportunity to keep them aware of the importance of the task that they're performing. It turns off some volunteers if a police information check isn't actually necessary, but it can be a sign to a volunteer that the work that they're doing matters and that they're volunteering with an organization that values their community's safety. Some organizations also use learning opportunities like workshops and webinars and symposiums and just general professional development work to get their volunteers involved. This is not something that has to just be done by staff. If you think that a volunteer could, benefit from doing some, workshops or webinars or e-learning or professional development work in general, then I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of that, because it gets the volunteer to take a look at their role, not just as work that they're doing, but as a position they can actually grow within. Another engagement activity is offering new roles. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So offering new roles within your organization, like say a volunteer has been with your organization in an operational capacity for a really long time and they're getting, a little bit bored of it. With all of that operational knowledge, maybe they have something they can contribute to the board or like a committee or something like that. So talking to them about those opportunities might be a good way to kind of keep them involved and keep them engaged. And then we're also going to mention here yearly evaluations. And we're going to get more into this in the next few slides, because feedback is actually probably one of the most key parts of engagement and re-engagement. So recognition activities, though, I'm just kind of outlining them here to avoid that common kind of pitfall. Recognition activities can include lots of different things like dinners and parties and gift cards and baskets, but there's also like providing statistics on impact, because often volunteers don't see the impact of what they're doing. So giving them something that actually proves to them that the work that they're doing matters is a great act of recognition of what they're doing. Crediting them in communications if they're okay with it, like say a couple of volunteers did something really awesome for your organization over the weekend. Posting about it on like social media if they're okay with it might be a great way to recognize them and and say that they're awesome, this is great. But there's also just saying thank you, and Volunteer Alberta has actually done a lot of research, and one of the key things that we found with recognition is that volunteers, more than anything else, more than a parade down Main Street saying that they're a great volunteer, all they want is the people that they're working with to actually say thank you. So make sure that you do that. Okay. Next topic we're going to talk about is feedback here. So we talked about what engagement is in reference to yearly evaluation in the last slide. But like, how do we actually create a conversation and let volunteers know that we want to hear what they have to say? That's really the cornerstone of engagement and re-engagement, is listening to and understanding your volunteers. And you can't do that without feedback. Okay, so first form of feedback here that we're going to talk about is the old standby, which is surveys. Surveys that can be distributed to volunteers on a yearly or twice yearly basis, or more or less if you see fit. It's up to your organization, but to help gather information about volunteers, and it helps kind of establish how volunteers are feeling about their work. So building surveys and data collection is a field of study on its own. I'm not going to try to explain how to make the best survey right now, because that's a big question in and of itself. But here's some general rules of thumb if you're creating a survey to gather feedback to better engage your volunteers. Only gather information that you're going to use. This doesn't mean information that you might use. Think about what you actually need to know and design your questions to gather this data specifically. This is big for PIPA and FOIP and privacy legislation, because you don't want to gather personal information that you don't need. But just in a general sense, it's harder to interpret a survey later, and it takes up the volunteer's time if you're gathering information that you're not going to use. Next tip is keep it short. The volunteer should be able to give feedback easily and reflect positively on the process. So make it easy for them to do this. And then the last tip that I'm going to give for surveys here is pick question formats that suit the information that you need. So this means use multiple choice questions for questions that have limited number of answers. Open-ended questions for qualitative data. Number fields for quantitative data. Just think about these little things, and that'll help kind of your data stay clean and actually be helpful in the future. Okay. Focus groups. So if you're in the process of rolling out a new program or a volunteer position, it could be really helpful to get a small group of volunteers in the room to answer questions about their experiences or something like that. But can also just be a valuable way to garner, general qualitative data about your volunteer program. Sometimes focus groups are thrown together really quickly, so there's a few things that you should remember if you're putting together a focus group. Keep it informal. This shouldn't be a scary process, especially for volunteers. Have a good facilitator. It's really important that the person who's running these focus groups actually knows how to steer and direct conversation, because it can get off track really easily. And then try to focus on positive and actionable items, because people really like to complain when you give them an option to. So a focus group can easily devolve into just complaining. And you want to actually have focus groups, create feedback that you can use in the future, and, people will reflect positively on the process. So keep it positive, keep it actionable. And the next feedback items we have here, we are really proponents at Volunteer Alberta of actually building individual relationships with your volunteers whenever possible. Getting the ability to actually cultivate a relationship with your volunteers where you can actually just sit down with them and ask them what they think about certain aspects of their role is really important. And this can be check-ins where you schedule regular, short, occurring chances to chat with your volunteers. It can just be individual discussions based on, whatever issues might be necessary to talk about at the time. But just to stay equitable, not everyone is okay with this type of closeness in a volunteer role, and that's okay. Just having a mechanism for anonymous feedback might be kind of important too. Ultimately, your goal might be to get them to the point where they can just talk with you casually, but to ensure that volunteers are actually comfortable in their role, that might force you to actually think about whether or not volunteers are actually at the point where they can just sit down with you and talk to you. So providing anonymous feedback options is, often very valuable for volunteers. Okay, so up until this point, we've talked about how to engage volunteers, how to help them feel supported, how to improve your program's practices. We've focused a lot on how to improve program practices because engagement methods might really depend a lot on the different organizations that you're in. But we're going to dive into the re-engagement part here, and it's a little bit hard to kind of separate out engagement and re-engagement because they're very similar processes, but we're going to try doing that using this tool called the learning loop. So to illustrate how we can start some of the work that we've done, up to this point, I've taken a model from the social innovation world to map out the direction that we're going to be headed. So this model is from the DIY toolkit, and a full version of the PDF with instructions is attached to this presentation. It's called the learning loop, and this learning loop, it just gives a very straightforward idea of how to learn from feedback and provide space for you to actually jot down some ideas of what you can do along the way. When we talk about re-engagement and a feedback loop, we're talking about evaluating need, creating action items, responding, tracking process, and reviewing impact. And that's essentially what the learning loop is. It's not a new concept at all, as is the case with a lot of social innovation models. It's just kind of a way to map out a fairly intuitive process, because if you ask a person how to improve on something, chances are they might have an idea of what to do, but they haven't actually broken it out into a pattern of thought. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the learning loop. It's taking an implicit process and making it explicit. Okay, so I'm going to go through this tool with a little bit of an example. So say your example is that you're experiencing a drop in volunteer participation with your organization. So the first step within this loop is collecting stories and insights. So say the first thing that you do when you experience that drop in volunteer participation is you set up some focus groups with existing volunteers, you have phone chats with volunteers who stopped volunteering, and overall you found that volunteers are just too busy or they've simply lost interest in their roles. Sorry, my computer's moving really slowly today. Okay, so the next step in the learning loop here is prioritizing feedback and solutions. So you can't easily control if people lose interest in a core role that needs to be structured in a certain way. So say your organization is one of those organizations that's part of a larger national network, and you have parent organizations that hand down positions that need to be filled in a certain way. Or maybe you just have the type of organization where there's certain core volunteer positions that just can't change. And if people lose interest in those roles, there's not much you can do about about that specifically. But there's ways that you could come up with maybe flexible scheduling arrangements for them to work. Like if people are too busy, is there ways that you could split up some of these core roles into work that could be done flexibly? Like something that we've seen a lot with COVID is organizations that have work that could be done remotely, but they've had people do it in person for years and years and years just because that's what's comfortable. But if you have the ability to, take old volunteer positions and restructure them so they could be done in a flexible way or remotely, that could be a lifesaver for some volunteers who feel too busy to actually do their work. Another thing that you could do is actually see if people want to try new roles. So if people have lost interest in their role, see if there's anything else that they could do in the organization. Okay, so the next step here is tracking indicators and progress. So we're going to be tracking how well this is working. So we need to kind of think about like, okay, we're going to do these things from the previous step. How are we going to actually, track that? So if you're moving people into new roles, maybe some of the progress along the way is that you're noticing some of those old roles are now shorthanded. So that's something that you should probably keep track of. And if you want to track how people are kind of doing within these flexible schedules that I was mentioning in the previous section, maybe you can send short check-in surveys on a regular basis to just kind of get data and figure out if that's working for them. And then for the people who've moved into new roles, if you are, say, a volunteer manager or board member or something like that, maybe scheduling one-on-one check-ins with people who've actually moved into those new roles might be a helpful way to keep track of how they're doing. And then we get into this last little section here, which is reviewing outputs and impact. So like in this example, say the flex scheduling is helping existing volunteers feel more comfortable in their work. Maybe they're feeling more in control of their work. Volunteers in new roles seem to be enjoying the change of pace, and I put old roles are being filled because this is a volunteer recruitment presentation, so maybe all of your recruitment efforts are helping those old roles be filled. This is just an example. Hopefully that's the case. And then next, participation is leveled out, but there's still no substantial increase in new volunteers. So you've stopped the drop in volunteer participation, but you haven't really increased volunteer participation. So you could take maybe the next challenge as how do I increase my volunteer participation? And then you move into the first step of the loop again. So this is kind of how we use the learning loop. It's a continuous improvement tool, and that is the name of the game when we're talking about re-engagement. We're talking about continuous improvement. We're talking about taking what is working for your organization and monitoring if it's still working and changing processes as needed to ensure that it keeps engaging people. Okay. And then in closing about engagement, engagement includes things that you actually do to get volunteers actively involved in their role. And it means they're actually showing up in their role, wanting to be there and invested in their work. So as we talked about previously, this isn't just recognition, and it's not just having volunteers show up. It's about having them show up and care about what they're doing in some way, shape, or form. And the other note, and I kind of kept this short because I really wanted this to kind of be one of the key takeaways when it comes to engagement in this presentation, is that engagement requires feedback and continuous improvement. That's the cornerstone of this activity, feedback and continuous improvement. And that's kind of the closing here. I want to give some time for questions because it's already 12:47, so I want to kind of not take up too much of your lunch hour and give some chance for chatting. So we're going to switch over to the questions portion here. And there was a bunch of questions that kind of popped up that were kind of tech questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to quickly take a look through here and see if there's anything related to the content. And I'll try and answer them if there's anything. I'm not seeing anything there, but if anybody has anything that they'd like to ask or if they'd like to chat, there's a hands up feature that should be attached to your GoToWebinar panel, and you can use that and I'll know that you want to be unmuted, and then I can go and unmute you and we can chat a little bit if you're interested. Thanks, Karen. I just saw your note here. I'm glad that you found it interesting. Did anybody have any questions around recruitment or engagement or re-engagement? And it's okay if not. One thing that I'll note too is that Volunteer Alberta always tries to stay as open as possible to talk to people. So after this presentation, we're definitely going to send along the handouts that were attached to this webinar and also the slide deck and the recording. So you'll be able to review all of this content whenever you'd like. If you have any other questions as you are as you're reviewing that stuff, you can always feel free to email us. So you can just respond right back to me, or you can always email Victoria at vpeta@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. Yeah, we'll definitely get back to you and try and help as much as we can. And I'm just seeing, Dorte, your message about the people who weren't able to attend. I'm really sorry about that. I find with any webinar software, sometimes it's tricky to get the tech ready for everybody. But if there's any issues at all, we're happy to send out all of the recorded content and offer ourselves as question and answer people to anybody who has any questions after this. Yeah. Oh, I see a question here. During the situation with COVID, how has the recruitment strategies changed in terms of connecting with new possible, I'm assuming that means volunteers. Oh, so, sorry, Miles. I'm just there's kind of a lot going through the question box here, and I'm just trying to make sure that I stay on top of everything. But how has COVID changed recruitment strategies? So that is a really good question. In fact, when COVID first struck, there was this big kind of scramble within the capacity building area of the nonprofit sector, which Volunteer Alberta sits in, to figure out how to get volunteers to kind of engage differently, because we had to do that to make sure that volunteer positions were actually meeting health and safety guidelines. And there was a lot of organizations that entirely restructured their programming to be able to fit these new virtual roles if possible. That was a big part of it. But then in terms of recruitment strategy, Volunteer Connector actually became really, really key during COVID, because the government of Alberta ended up partnering with Propellus, the organization that runs Volunteer Connector, this online kind of volunteer bank, almost like, volunteer opportunity bank. So if you saw news come out a few months ago called about a platform called Alberta Cares Connector, it was essentially a rebranded COVID-specific version of Volunteer Connector, and that was one of the big things that people kind of saw as the new wave of volunteer recruitment within COVID times was online recruitment. However, there's also kind of different forms of online recruitment. So when COVID started, there was also like all of these different Facebook groups that started popping up on Facebook, and also just social media in general, where people were just organizing without any specific nonprofit organization to fulfill volunteer roles that needed to be fulfilled within their community. So we had people posting on those, or I shouldn't say we, because Volunteer Alberta didn't run them, but Albertans all over the province were posting on those to be like, my friend needs help getting their groceries. Can anybody help with them? Or, my friend is having trouble getting out of their house today because, they are they have like a disability or something like that. And we had like all sorts of people from all over the province just coming out and doing these little bits of volunteering. So I would say that social media and Facebook are actually probably going to be really important when it comes to recruitment in the future. At least that's my thoughts. Okay. Did anybody else have any questions? Oh, and I see Dorte said that the links went to the People's Norquest address and they didn't check that. Ah, I see. Okay. Well, if there's any way that we can help after the start date, feel free to reach out, and we'll work with you to make sure that we can help as much as we can. Oh, and I see a hand up. Hey,
Oh, hi, Glenn. I just wanted to thank you very much, you and Victoria, for the presentation. That was a lot of very good information. If people are not asking questions, it's probably because they're still digesting the content.
for sure.
We really appreciate the accommodation for making the recording available to us. I would love to have that, as well as the wonderful handouts. So what happened was that we usually send links to two sets of email addresses, both the Norquest and the personal ones. And in this case, I don't think that that's what happened.
Oh,
So that's kind of how we lost a lot of people. So there's a couple of people I have asked Victoria to send recordings to, and other than that, I think we're great. So
awesome.
thanks very much for your contribution today. We really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Okay. Well, I guess I'll talk with people later, and yeah, have a great day.